by Edward Allen Kurtz. Famous people. Frederick Douglass. Written by Edward Allen Kurtz. Frederick Douglass by Edward Allen Kurtz. Learn about this famous American writer, diplomat, speaker, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Who was he and why he was famous? Contents. Who was Frederick Douglass? Slavery. Young Frederick. Starting his education as Mr. Auld. Clubs and Stones. From Slavery to Freedom. Anna Murray. New Bedford, Massachusetts. An Upward Path to Equality.
Who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was a famous writer, diplomat, speaker, and abolitionist. What is an abolitionist? Frederick Douglass, like many other abolitionists, worked hard for more than several hundred years to abolish or put an end to slavery. What is very interesting is that Douglass had been a slave himself before joining the abolitionists in fighting against slavery. Slave owners could not believe that a former slave could be smart enough to read and write and make speeches. Slavery. Slavery is a very terrible thing. White people who were living in the southern states believed that black people were not as good as white people. White people thought that black people were not humans. They thought that black people were like animals and that they could be bought and sold. Douglass was born as a black slave on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. He didn't know the date of his birth. His mother called him her Little Valentine. Since Valentine's Day is February 14th, Douglass's family celebrated this date as his birthday. Young Frederick. Can you imagine someone taking you away from your house and your family? And then you had to work very hard on a cotton plantation or farm. There were many cotton plantations in the southern states, and using slaves saved the white plantation owners money. But, very sadly, families were torn apart in the system of slavery. Douglass was taken away from his mother when he was a young infant. The white slave owner made young Douglass live with his grandmother, who was also a slave. Starting his education as a slave. When he was 6 years old, he was sent to Baltimore. Baltimore was near the border between the North, against slavery, and the South. His new owner, Mrs. Auld, was a very kind woman, and she could see that Douglass was a special boy. She wanted to help him have a better life. He began to learn the alphabet when he was about 12 years old. She taught him how to treat other people with kindness. But suddenly, something changed, and Douglass was no longer treated like a special slave. Mr. Auld. Mr. Auld did not like to see his wife teach Douglass. Mr. Auld still believed that Douglass was a slave, like an animal, that you could buy and sell. Why did Mr. Auld stop the lessons? What was he afraid of? He thought that if slaves began to become educated, they might start to get anti-slavery feelings. Even though the lessons with Mrs. Auld stopped, Douglass's lessons did not stop. He continued to teach himself, borrowing books from white children in his neighborhood. Clubs and Stones. Douglass was sold again, this time to a white plantation owner named William Freeland. Douglass began to teach other slaves. Mr. Freeland did not care very much about the education meetings for slaves, but other white men were very angry. At one of the meetings, the white plantations burst into the place where the slaves were learning. The white man used clubs and stones. The slaves quickly ran away from the meeting, but the story of slavery was not finished yet. From Slavery to Freedom. Douglass was sold to Edward Covey. He was a poor farmer and was known to treat his slaves in a very mean way. One time Douglass fought back. Covey never tried to beat Douglass again. Douglass tried to escape several times, but he was unsuccessful each time. Finally, he was able to get on a train that took him north on his way to a city in the slavery state of Maryland. This city was only 20 miles from Pennsylvania, a state that was against slavery. But how did he do this? Where did he get his money and tickets? Anna Murray. Some slaves were able to become free by buying their freedom. This was not easy because slaves had very little money. When Douglass was in Baltimore, he met a woman named Anna Murray. She was free. They fell in love and were married for 44 years. Anna Murray Douglass was the source of help and money for Douglass to leave the slavery state of Maryland and enter the anti-slavery state of Pennsylvania. Douglass and his new wife continued to the northern state of New York, another anti-slavery state. New Bedford, Massachusetts. Douglass and his new wife continued north to New Bedford in Massachusetts, another anti-slavery state. They picked this city because it was known for having many slaves. It was also an abolitionist center. Douglass had changed his names many times during his attempts to escape slavery. Now that he was settled in New Bedford, he chose the name of Douglass based on the name of characters from a famous poem he liked. It was called The Lady of the Lake. 2 characters in the poem are called Douglass. An Upward Path to Equality. People began to ask Douglass to speak about inequality and his rough life as a slave. Although the northern states were against abolition, black people were still treated differently than white people. In 1845, he wrote a book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was a bestseller. Later, he gave speeches in Ireland and Great Britain. Back in America, he continued to work for equality for slaves and women. Many good things happened because of the hard work and intelligence of Frederick Douglass. But there is still much we must do today until we all agree that everyone is equal.